For many small-scale growers, compost is a primary input and often the only thing we add to the garden soil apart from seeds. And in a lot of cases, that can be enough to grow really great quality vegetables if the soil and compost are both good enough. But not all compost is the same, and a lot of growers struggle with their crops, and I suspect that many more don't know how much better their crops could be if they had better compost or more appropriate amendments. I used to be in that situation, and I've been learning a lot and finding ways to improve the soil I have to work with using inputs that I can easily get. This has led me to go against some long-standing biases that I've had, and I experimented with significantly amending the municipal compost that I got last year for a few of the gardens. There were some issues with this, but I was really impressed with the results, with perhaps some of the best growth I've ever seen in the gardens. I call this compost that I buy in municipal compost, and I usually can get it delivered in large bags whenever I need it. And I like using it, as it's clean, contains no plastic or other unsuitable stuff, and is fairly consistent. It's easy to work with, properly sieved, and is unlikely to contain any diseases or weed seeds or herbicide residue. At least I hope so with the organic certification. This compost is ready to use right away, but only really as a mulching compost, as I found that even with aging, it still struggles to provide the nutrients that plants seem to need. This was the focus of one of the big trials in the past few years, where I grew potato plants in large bags of this municipal compost that I had amended in different ways. The main thing I learned was that the plants benefited the most when I added a lot more nitrogen in soluble form, either urine or concentrated soluble nitrogen fertilizer. This compost is very high carbon, probably made mainly from wood chip and other woody material, with just enough high nitrogen material mixed in to get the composting process going. It is a great mulching compost, but with a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, there are issues with digging this compost into the soil, as it will potentially lock up some of the nitrogen that is already there. But I think there are ways to improve this compost, to potentially turn it into a more valuable feeding compost in a relatively short period of time. In previous years, before adding this municipal compost to the surface of the garden beds, I would have generally spread different forms of concentrated fertility that I also buy in. I've done this to boost the amount of nitrogen that would be available to the plants, which I am assuming would not be available from the layer of compost on top. I also try to add more phosphorus, which is generally low in this calcareous soil that we have, and also not so abundant in this type of compost. We don't have the same kind of issues with potassium in the soil, and compost like this generally brings in a lot of potassium, possibly too much. Some form of sulfur can also be a useful thing to add, as the soil tests I have done show that this element is in short supply. And I think that seaweed meal is generally useful for adding a wide range of trace elements. All of these nutrients and trace elements likely already exist in the soil, but they might not be so available, or they might be locked up, or it might be hard for the rapidly growing plants to get everything that they need. There are ways to improve the bioavailability of these nutrients in the soil, but at the scale that I'm working at, I think it's often easier to simply buy in what is needed. I have had this idea for a while that if I wanted to add something to the gardens, it was probably better to put it through the composting process first, rather than adding it directly to the soil. Any potentially problematic issues could be worked through in the compost bin rather than in the soil, where it could cause problems for the plants and soil biology. There is also an issue with our high pH calcareous soil, where apparently nutrients like phosphorus can be locked up within the soil itself, where a lot of the phosphorus that is added doesn't end up being available to the plants. So it makes sense to me to add this type of amendment to the compost pile first, where the complex biology can extract the nutrients and incorporate them into the organic material. This does delay getting the nutrients into the garden, but potentially more of the phosphorus and other nutrients that I add will eventually become available to the plants. This past year, I decided to experiment with directly amending the municipal compost before adding it to the gardens. I figure that if I'm already buying in this high carbon material, it makes sense to mix in other ingredients to significantly boost the levels of nitrogen as well as other key nutrients. This will hopefully make these bags of mulching compost more valuable, potentially turning it into a feeding compost. But in order to make any substantial difference, I would need to add a lot of nitrogen to balance out the huge amount of carbon, and there are a number of different ways I could do this. I could mix in a lot of some other form of organic matter that is really high in nitrogen, like fresh manure, or layer in grass clippings, fresh clover leaves, or lots of nettles, or some other leaves that I knew were really rich in nitrogen. I could also add this municipal compost as a high carbon layer in my own compost piles, instead of the carbon and straw and other browns that I usually use. Though this would be adding a clean material to a compost pile with lots of plastic and weed seeds. I could collect and store enough urine, which contains nitrogen and other soluble nutrients, and drench the bags of municipal compost with it, or just use this compost as a urinal for a while. I could also buy in chicken manure pellets or hair mill pellets or some other organic source of high nitrogen fertility that I can buy from my usual supplier, but this would be a more expensive approach, especially with the delivery cost. A lot of these options would also add phosphorus and other nutrients, which would be great, but I prefer to not add more potassium as there is already a lot of it in this municipal compost. Or I could use conventional soluble fertilizer that didn't contain potassium, which I can easily pick up from an agricultural supply store in my local town at a fraction of the price of the organic options if I was willing to buy 50 kilogram bags at a time. Because the landscape that we live in is dominated by beef and dairy farms, conventional soluble fertilizer is the cheapest and easiest option. Of course, there are issues with conventional fertilizers like this, and there are also issues with all of the other amendments, compost, manure, and biomass that it can bring into the gardens. There can be issues related to the origin of the material itself, issues caused elsewhere in the production or transportation, problematic things being brought in with it, and the impact it has on our own soil and local landscape. And of course, cost and availability is often a big factor. Nothing is ideal, and selecting one option over another really depends on the context and my biases, and weighing up the pros and cons of the different options, which can be difficult. And I also think that it depends on how I'm going to use it. Adding any kind of fast-acting, concentrated, soluble fertility directly to the soil can cause significant issues, especially if repeated over many years. But I think adding it to the compost first can significantly reduce these possible issues within the local soil and environment. And if that's the case, then the cheapest and easiest form of fertility becomes a more viable option for amending this type of municipal compost. I don't have to follow any external organic certification or similar restrictions that would prevent the careful and considered use of this type of fertilizer. The main thing holding me back were my own biases that I've had for a long time against using conventional fertilizers like this. But I think it's an important thing to explore. I still had a partial bag of urea fertilizer from the previous potato grow bag trial, and I bought a bag of CAN Plus, or calcium ammonium nitrate with additional sulfur, and a bag of phosphate fertilizer from the local farm supply company. This is very concentrated stuff, and a lot of fertility, enough for quite a few years at the scale I'm growing at. I didn't really know how much of these concentrated amendments to add to one large bag of compost, but I made some rough calculations based off of the typical analysis provided by the compost supplier. And I weighed out different types of soluble fertilizer to provide what I thought was an appropriate amount of nitrogen and phosphorus to add to each bag. And I mixed it all together with seaweed meal, which is one of the main inputs that I regularly use in my gardens. I shoveled the municipal compost from one bag into another and layered in this mix of concentrated fertility to try to get a roughly even distribution through the full amount of compost. I also watered the bags with a compost slurry made from my own high-quality compost to add in some diverse biology that may have been missing. And then I covered the bags and let them sit for more than a month before digging out the compost and starting to use it in the gardens. I really didn't know how this would all work out, and there were a few issues, mostly related to using the compost too soon and amending it in mid-February. About 6 weeks after amending, there was still a slight smell of ammonia when I dug into the compost, which was a sign that the biology still had work to do, and the fertilizer had not been mixed in enough with the compost, or I had added too much. I had used some of this compost as a side dressing around some young plants in the polytunnel that I then covered with fleece to protect from the frost, and some of the leaves were damaged, probably by the off-gassing ammonia. I now realize that the temperature of the compost was probably way too low for there to be any real biological activity to work in all the nitrogen I had added in with the carbon of the compost. I should have amended this compost a lot earlier in warmer weather and mixed it together more thoroughly, and delayed using the compost a bit, especially around tender transplants that were covered. Most of this amended compost was used as a side dressing in a few of the outside gardens later in the spring, so it would have had a lot longer to mature. There might have been some issues with leaching or off-gassing of nitrogen, but we didn't have a very wet summer, so I think this would have been minimized. The vegetable plants in the gardens where I used this compost grew really well this year, a lot of them better than I've seen them grow before. The weather was reasonable for most of the growing season, at least for most of the types of plants that I was growing in these gardens. And some of the improvement in these crops could have been due to me slowly getting better at my job as a grower. But the crops generally seemed more productive and healthier in these gardens, and I think that the compost I had added in the spring was able to help provide the plants with the nutrients they needed for the full growing season. At least for the heavy feeding long season crops like potatoes, kale, and other large brassicas. There were some issues with crops like onions in these gardens, where quite a few of the bulbs split, which apparently can be caused by lots of nitrogen being available in the soil when the plants are starting to ripen. I had not seen this before, or at least not to this extent, and it indicates to me that the compost was still making nitrogen available, even when it would have been better for the crop if there was less of it around during the summer. While I think that the better availability of nitrogen would have been a factor in the success of these gardens, I also think that greater availability of phosphorus also helped. I think not getting enough phosphorus has compromised the health and productivity of the gardens in the past, and I think the same could be said about sulfur, which I had also added. If amending compost like this helps to make these essential nutrients more available to the plants, then it's definitely worth doing again. And I am doing it again. I bought in more bags of this municipal compost in the late summer, and I repeated the process of transferring it into another bag and layering in a similar mix of soluble fertilizer, seaweed, and some of my own biologically active compost as an inoculant. The compost would have been warmer, so the biology would have been more active, and the covered bags had more time to mature. I haven't used most of it yet, and might still wait until spring at this point to avoid any heavy winter rains washing nutrients out of the compost. I should really do a proper trial of all this to figure out how much of this concentrated fertility is best to add and to compare it to the unamended stuff. This is all part of my continuing explorations into figuring out how to use all the different resources that I can get to grow more food. Of course, this all depends on context, and there's lots of different ways to increase the availability of nutrients for plants, and I'm experimenting with many of them in other growing spaces. Some of these methods are slower or more natural, some are based on green manures, some are more appropriate under organic certification, some focus on working more with microbes, some involve soil tests and careful amendments, and some are based on making better compost in whatever way works. I took a big step years ago when I first started buying in this municipal compost, and another big step this past year when I started to try to significantly upgrade this material with conventional fertilizers, stuff that I would be hesitant to use directly in the soil. I do think it's interesting that I feel like I'm cheating in some way or doing something wrong with both of these steps, even though these resources are things that people growing their own food have easy access to or need to rely on. Fundamentally, I think it's important to focus on growing more food, and I'm no longer sure that there is a right way to do this. But we should always work to reduce the negative effects of whatever we do with the resources we can get, and to increase the positive effects, whatever they may be within our context. So I will keep exploring. In an ideal world, we would have easy access to all of the resources that we need to grow lots of great quality food in ways that match our preconceptions and beliefs about the best way to do things. And hopefully that approach and those methods end up being really successful within whatever context or soil we are working with. I have found that that is often not the case, and we can't easily get what we think we need, and methods don't always work everywhere as well as we would hope. This is something that I'm really interested in continuing to explore to help more people grow more of their own food using whatever resources they can easily get. And perhaps to help more people to see that there are many different ways to manage our growing spaces to produce lots of great quality food, each with their own constraints, problems, and benefits. If you think this type of exploration is important and like the kinds of videos that I make, please consider supporting my work and this Red Gardens project through Patreon or PayPal. The links to both are in the description below. As usual, liking, sharing, and subscribing always help, but more importantly, thank you for watching.